In the aftermath of World War II, 10 European nations, Canada and the United States, met in Washington, D.C. on April 4, 1949, to sign the North Atlantic Treaty, which would give birth to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Its stated purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. But for Russia, NATO represents a Western threat against its borders and security. Ukraine sits at the heart of what NATO means to Europe and Russia. With Russia's borders quickly running against NATO blue lines, the battle for Ukraine is more than just about the country itself, but about the future of peace in Europe. What exactly is NATO, and why is it so important to Europe and the US? What was Putin referring to when he warned the West of consequences greater than any you have faced in history if the West interfered with Ukraine? And what happens if this whole situation goes nuclear? I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters. This episode is brought to you by Tekto Gear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tekto Gear knives won't cost a half month's rent either. Today, Tekto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use the discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. A few months ago, as Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, I was approached with an interesting question regarding the headlines covering the story. I was asked, what is NATO? Now, I've been in the US military for almost 20 years, so I thought I had a basic understanding of NATO, so I rattled off the acronym and a very topical explanation of it being an alliance to protect Europe, but honestly, that's all I had. I knew it had to do with World War II, and that for the last couple of decades, a lot of talk was going around concerning NATO and whether or not we still needed it around, but now NATO is all over the headlines, and I felt like I really didn't understand what NATO really was, why some folks thought we didn't need it anymore, and what any of that had to do with Ukraine. Blame that on my lack of world knowledge if you want, but it feels like many of us, service members and veterans alike, are waking up from the nightmare that was the global war on terror and realizing that while we were focused on terror organizations, IEDs, and winding down US presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the rest of the world and its militaries were quite active and engaged in political and military issues that never really stopped being a concern to them. Some of these issues are holdovers from as far back as World War I, maybe even longer, but the fact is that a lot of us are playing catch-up when it comes to understanding the European problem sets. And now that Russia is invading Ukraine, it's critical to understand NATO and why World War III just went from fanciful Amazon Prime movie plot to a dangerous and very real possibility. To better understand NATO, I turn to the author of Enduring Alliance, A History of NATO and the Postwar Global Order, Dr. Timothy Sayles.
My name is Timothy Sayles, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. And there I research and write about the history of NATO and also teach about the connections between history and international affairs today.
So what exactly is NATO?
This is a fantastic question, and you'll get different answers from different people. And the reason is NATO is actually a combination of things. It's a treaty, it's an integrated military command, and it's a forum where diplomats from different states come together to talk about their interests. So NATO was born at the very beginning of the Cold War as an instrument to deter the Soviet Union from trying to control more of Europe. And so NATO played a really important role for the decades of the Cold War. And what's so curious is at the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, when the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, NATO did not go away. In fact, all of the allies decided that NATO should continue and that, in fact, NATO should even grow. And so for a number of security reasons, security calculations made in Washington, London, and other capitals, the NATO allies agreed to accept former Warsaw Pact states, so allies of the Soviet Union, into NATO. And so NATO, in effect, moved east in Europe, an alliance that was formerly only in Western Europe, by the late 1990s was already including Hungary, Poland, what used to be Czechoslovakia, and has continued to add members all the way up until today with this effort by Sweden and Finland to join NATO. So NATO has been growing. It started with 12 members, is now at 30, will soon be at 32. And so the alliance is the main security club in Europe. Of course, Russia does not belong to this club, and there have always been tensions between NATO and the Soviet Union, and then NATO and Russia. It's why NATO was created in the first place.
You have to remember that during World War II, the US and Britain allied themselves with communist Russia to defeat the Nazis. Once the Nazis were defeated, it was obvious who the next problem was going to be: Soviet Russia. So NATO was formed in order to deter Soviet expansionism, forbid the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe, i.e. Nazis, through a strong North American presence on the continent, and encourage European political integration. But with the Nazis out of the way, those pillars became more about Soviet Russia than anything else.
Yes, that's right. And in particular, actions that the Soviet Union was taking in Europe. So real political actions that the Soviets were taking. And here, there are details that I think we forget, but they're really important. And there are a few examples that show why leaders in the United States, in France, in Great Britain decided that something like NATO was necessary. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union had developed this enormous military power. And that was on the minds of military and intelligence analysts in the West. But what they also saw was the Soviet Union using its military power as a political instrument against other states. In the late 1940s, it became clear that the Soviet Union was willing and able to use its military power to affect politics in war-torn Western Europe. In 1948, there was a coup in Czechoslovakia when communists took over Czechoslovakia. And we know, and officials knew at the time, that these communists felt emboldened to stage their coup because they knew the Red Army was essentially waiting in the wings and expected they would have that support if they needed it. So that was sort of one of the first dominoes that fell in Europe. And it looked like more dominoes were going to fall. The Soviet Union was preparing to make a request of Norway, requesting rights and access that the Norwegians didn't want to give up. But the Norwegians, after having suffered the Second World War, weren't about to go to war on their own against the Soviet Union over this demand that they could not make good on. And so, fascinatingly, Norway, the small country in Northern Europe, actually sent its diplomats to Washington, to London, to Ottawa in Canada, and said that they needed help, that the countries of Western Europe and North America needed to stand together politically to protect themselves from these demands from the Soviet Union. And so it was within this era in which the Soviet Union both had military power and was able to use it in support of their political demands that leaders, especially in Washington and London, decided it was time to organize an alliance to make sure that the Soviet Union's influence didn't creep further west in Europe.
The spread of communism was as terrifying then as COVID was to us about a year ago. We're talking about a period of decades in which the U.S. experienced the Red Scare, the Espionage Act of 1917, and the Sedition Act of 1918, which pretty much stomped on the notion of free speech and led to the arrest of thousands of Americans for saying and even thinking the wrong things. Then into World War II and post-World War II, McCarthyism had reared its ugly head, and despite the overreactions, the Soviets were actively engaged in espionage and subversion against the US, which resulted in them acquiring nuclear capabilities. And then we begin the nuclear standoff for the decades that would follow. While there were real threats, the panic and fear of communists lurking in every shadow was a real one, and it was felt by Americans and lawmakers alike. But let's stop here for a moment. I think we understand a bit more clearly about why NATO came to be, and that despite the fall of the Soviet Union, many of those fears transfer to what would become Russia. After all, their president is literally a Soviet holdover, a former KGB colonel. But I wanted to know, what was the difference between the United Nations and NATO? Because it would seem to me that they were both alliances of nations with an aim of keeping the peace. But what exactly is the difference?
It's a really important question. If we go back historically, there was so much hope in 1945 that the United Nations organization, as it was then called, would be the instrument that would save the world from the scourge of war, right? That it would be the organization that kept peace. And over the 1940s, because of these aggressive moves by the Soviet Union and the complex world at the end of the war, it became clear that that political forum wasn't the right tool for management, that there needed to be a commitment by states to use force in the defense of others to keep, in this case, Europe at peace. So NATO exists for a much more specific reason than the United Nations. It doesn't have this global or all-encompassing commitment to a number of different functions. It really was created to defend and deter Europe. So it's a more focused organization, smaller membership, and it is based, I think, on a different expectation of how best to keep peace in the world.
Ukraine isn't a NATO member, but it is considered a NATO partner for peace. This status came about with the launch of the Partners for Peace initiative launched in 1994 in order to, quote, establish strong links between NATO, its new democratic partners in the former Soviet bloc, and some of Europe's traditionally neutral countries to enhance European security, end quote. So with NATO having a pretty explicit mission statement of preventing Russia from expanding into Europe, I was curious about what a NATO expert like Dr. Sayles was thinking when Russia committed to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not just the 2014 Crimea incursion, but the full-on invasion.
And this is a case where I can truly say I got this one wrong. So your readers or your listeners should take some caution here. I definitely got this wrong, but thinking about why I got it wrong is important. It's 2014, critical moment, as you mentioned. The Russians go ahead and annex Ukraine. The Russians go ahead and annex Crimea, so fully take over Crimea. And they also had invested forces into eastern Ukraine. And there had been this low boil war in eastern Ukraine from 2014 up until this invasion, something like 15,000 people dead. So we knew that Ukraine was still contested. We knew that the Russians still were trying to achieve something there. And the real question was, how would they go forward? And perhaps because of my studies of the past and the challenge that NATO officials always saw in encountering hybrid threats, how difficult it is when unattributed forces show up and people, civilians, make political claims, just how difficult it is to combat that, right? You can't shoot that. You can't shoot public opinion. It seemed like Freudian slip. It seemed like Russia had a number of tools that they could use to continue pushing for what they wanted in Ukraine, which was a change to Ukrainian foreign policy and perhaps some more territory from Ukraine moving to Russia. So I expected, because of what a powerful and difficult to meet tool it is to use this sort of gray zone warfare, unattributable actors, I thought that the Russians would proceed that way. And I thought that the conventional force invasion on a large scale would not happen. And I didn't think it would happen for two reasons. One, that I thought the world would turn against Russia. I just thought that that would be unacceptable to the rest of the world to see war like that return to Europe. But I will admit that I also just simply thought that if the Russians did choose that course, they would score a relatively quick but extremely brutal victory in Ukraine. And I didn't understand what would come next for Russia if they did that. And so I simply expected the Russians to keep using their sort of political tools, their espionage, their special operators to get what they wanted in Ukraine. And so I was extremely surprised at this move on Kyiv. So this lightning attack to try and topple the government and take the capital. I thought at most the Russians would just secure control of those eastern parts of Ukraine where they'd been fighting for years. So I was totally surprised by the war.
Ukraine and Russia had been at it for a long time. And as Dr. Sayles said, there had already been a conflict for the eastern region. So why didn't Ukraine ask for NATO membership before? Wouldn't that have solved their problems and kept Russia from messing with them any further?
Right. Yeah. So the relationship between Ukraine and NATO is a really important one, and it does go back some ways. In the 1990s, there was this great hope shared by so many that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia would be a different actor on the world stage, that Russia would become a full-fledged democracy and participate in the international system that the other Europeans and North Americans and others from around the world, Japan and others, had created. So there was real hope, but always a fear in the back of some people's minds that Russia might take on the guise of the Soviet Union. And by the late 1990s, some Ukrainian leaders really are starting to worry and wonder about Russia and Russia's relationship with Ukraine. So intriguingly, in the 2000s, it's in the 1990s and on, Russia does develop this relationship with NATO where there's a council that allows Russia and NATO to talk. And NATO and Ukraine develop a council that allows for a relationship between NATO and Ukraine. And there are exchanges and some training between NATO countries and Ukraine. And in the 2000s, with much more concern in Ukraine about Russia, there is pressure from Ukraine to join NATO. And there are some NATO allies that really support this and really strongly want Ukraine to join NATO. And at a NATO summit in 2008, there's actually a public communique from NATO saying that one day Ukraine will join NATO. The thing is, after the Cold War, NATO created a large number of steps, sort of an application system where states get ready to join the alliance. It deals with civil military relations in those countries, training, equipment, other legal issues. And in general, there's an agreement amongst the NATO countries that they will not admit a new member who has a territorial dispute with another country. Because if you allow in an ally who you're promising to defend, who is already in need of defense, it actually puts the alliance right into action right away. And so there was this tug of war within the alliance from 2008 on as to whether and when Ukraine should join NATO. I would say that in the lead up to this invasion, there was no real prospect of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. And so the Russian argument that, the NATO is about to accept Ukraine, there's no evidence for that. That it was a long way off. But there's always been this but there's always been this connection between Ukraine and NATO, this hope that one day Ukraine would be able to join the alliance. I think that the invasion itself has actually raised questions again about whether Ukraine should be admitted to NATO. There's obviously continued close connections between NATO countries and Ukraine. Although I have seen one slogan on social media that says, with the way the Ukrainians have fought in this war, instead of Ukraine applying to join NATO, maybe NATO will apply to join Ukraine. And I like that. I thought that was pretty funny.
It sounds like the Russians are playing their cards right. As long as they keep up an ongoing conflict with Ukraine, then Ukraine can't be granted membership into NATO per NATO's own rules. If they did bring in Ukraine, then it's tantamount to starting World War III. And it seems right now, no one wants that kind of smoke.
Exactly right. That's right. And that's why I thought the Russian strategy, just objectively, had been relatively effective. The 2014 actions in that low boil war had really taken the idea of Ukrainian membership in NATO off the table.
Earlier this year, Sweden and Finland reported Russian aircraft had breached their airspace. One incident may have involved a Russian bomber armed with nuclear warheads. This was clearly a response to discussions revolving around NATO fast-tracking their membership. You see, if Sweden and Finland join NATO, you'd only need a short glance at a map of NATO countries versus Russian borders to understand why Russia feels threatened. Also, the presence of a nuclear warhead, whether it was real or not, the perception that Russia was projecting adds a dangerous new element to the discussion, and it's that of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you two chunks here, both of which will have a little nuclear element, but they could probably get split up. Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO, this fast-track application by which they will join the alliance very quickly, does change the geostrategic picture for NATO, and it's important in a defensive context. It provides defense in depth, lines of communication, and other things that will help NATO defend NATO territory. The accession or joining of Finland and Sweden to NATO doesn't give NATO any new offensive capabilities against Russia. And there's a very important nuclear component to this. First, there's a connection to the Ukraine war we should touch on here. There was this discussion, did potential Ukrainian NATO membership cause the Russians to invade? Well, there's an interesting corollary here with Sweden and Finland, because some Russian diplomats had suggested in public that Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO was unacceptable. But the Finnish leader called Vladimir Putin, and after that phone call, Putin himself made a statement saying that it was acceptable to him that Finland and Sweden join NATO as long as there was no, what he called, NATO infrastructure in those countries. And infrastructure is something of a code word for nuclear offensive capabilities. So it seemed to me, reading between the leaves, that Putin was saying he is not going to make a big deal about Finland and Sweden joining NATO as long as there are no offensive nuclear capabilities or any nuclear capabilities in those countries. Now, this is actually how NATO has worked almost since its founding, because while Finland and Sweden were not a part of NATO, Norway has been a part of NATO, and Norway's deal has always been that it didn't want to have NATO nuclear weapons stationed on its territory, and the alliance found a way to make that work. So I have no reason to think or expect that NATO will introduce nuclear weapons into Finland and Sweden, and so the strategic benefit of their addition to the alliance is political, and it's also defensive in a military sense. But I see no reason for this accession to pose an offensive threat to the Russians. And I don't think Vladimir Putin sees it that way either, based on his statement.
So far, the U.S. hasn't put any warfighters on the ground in Ukraine. I think the world would agree that doing so would prompt an escalation of force on behalf of Russia. Putin already made his threat to the West concerning interference with consequences greater than you have faced in history, but does this mean Russia can do whatever it wants so long as it hovers its finger over its nuclear button?
I think that it's easy, because we haven't seen mushroom clouds, to forget that there is an enormous nuclear element to this war. And by that, I mean nuclear weapons are shaping the choices available to all of the sides in this conflict on one level or another. Of course, the Russians know that they're able to persecute this war and that others are not going to become overtly involved because the Russians still have another step in the escalatory ladder. They actually still have a number of steps in the escalatory ladder in which they could change the intensity of this war up to and including various levels of nuclear weapons. At the same time, NATO's nuclear weapons are also shaping this war. And one of the most fascinating things here, I think, is that pipeline of weapons that are entering Ukraine from NATO allies. So not from NATO itself, but from NATO allies. And they're clearly transiting through NATO territory, right? Being flown over NATO airspace, landing in NATO countries before entering into Ukraine. And if we look at the map, we can just see that must be the case. And so we might ask, in another century, we would have asked, well, why are the Russians just not moving into any of those neighboring countries and interdicting this weapons supply? Well, the way it's set up, NATO is actually serving as a backstop here, as essentially an umbrella that is protecting the flow of those weapons right into Ukraine. Because if Russian forces were going to strike or move into any of Ukraine's neighbors where these weapons are transiting, they would be attacking a NATO country. And it's really important to think about what would happen next in that case, because it is not a case, I think, of anyone, the president or nuclear-equipped prime minister of the United Kingdom, for example, simply pushing a button to escalate this to nuclear war. What we would see, I expect, would be a very hastily convened call of the NATO North Atlantic Council, a declaration of Article 5, which is the famous article of the NATO treaty that commits each state to help each other in case of invasion, and a discussion about what the response should be. And I expect this has been gamed out, planned out. There are a bunch of contingency scenarios that are in place, but NATO reacting to a Russian attack, it's something that would be, I expect, thought out and carefully calibrated. The reason I'm relatively confident in that is because I think the actions we've seen by NATO states so far have been really carefully calibrated to avoid escalating this war beyond into a spiral that gets out of control. I think we've seen perhaps hesitant steps, some may say too hesitant, but they've been very careful steps by Ukraine's friends to arm Ukraine in a way that gives Ukraine an advantage without pushing the Russians to a point of escalating this war into something even more catastrophic.
As Dr. Sayles and I were wrapping up our interview, he shared this remarkable story with me that really hits home a major point about NATO, that ties the events of World War II in with the NATO we see today.
So there's a real continuity between the lessons of the First and Second World War and why we have NATO today. On June 6th, 1944, D-Day, the night of D-Day, as American paratroopers approached Normandy, in one of the planes was the commanding officer of the 101st Airborne, Maxwell Taylor, and the jump master on that plane was a man named Lawrence Leger. Okay, and they both jump into Normandy. And Field Marshal Rommel, the Nazi commander, was absent from Normandy at that very moment. And so his chief of staff was in charge of the defenses, this German officer, Hans Spiedel. If you fast forward to the 1960s, to the JFK presidency, all of a sudden, that jump master, Lawrence Leger, is on the National Security Council staff advising President Kennedy. Maxwell Taylor is the chairman of the chiefs of staff. And that German officer is the commander of NATO Allied Forces Central Europe. And so what NATO did was build on the lessons of the Second World War, but also helped to heal some of the rifts in Europe that had led to that war, because NATO was able to bring Germany into the Allied fold. And you had these men who had fought against each other in the 1940s, now on the same side, working to defend and protect Western Europe. So it's the lessons of unpreparedness, of unwillingness to use military power early. All of these things contributed into the need to have an organized, integrated, and ready military force in Europe, backed up by a diplomatic agreement that did keep Europe free from general war from 1945 onward. Of course, we can only hope that that will remain true and that this war in Ukraine, escalated in 22, doesn't expand further.
When we return from the break, we talk with two nuclear experts about the war in Ukraine. The threat is real, but there's more to this than nuclear bombs. More when we return. Ideal for fishing, especially if one needs to quickly cut a line, the Romeo folding knife comes with a light carbon fiber handle with an amazing grip and a D2 steel blade. Fair warning, the blade is extremely sharp and cuts through the toughest materials. What makes it simple is the flipper tab. The knife pops open for quick use all in one single motion. Go to tektogear.com today. TektoGear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. During the 1950s and 60s, nuclear war with the Soviet Union felt almost inevitable. The 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis was a worldwide scare, as every country waited to see how two nuclear powers were going to solve their first real confrontation, in which the slightest misunderstanding by any party could thrust the world into World War III and a nuclear winter. In the first part of this episode, we talked with Dr. Timothy Sayles about NATO, and he described how NATO has been carefully supplying Ukraine with weapons and technology, but in a way as to not push Russia into taking more catastrophic approaches. Nuclear war and its weapons is a strange topic to discuss because, politically, it feels like it's never directly mentioned, only alluded to. Perhaps it's a way for leaders to say, I wasn't talking about nuclear, I was just saying that there would be devastating consequences. I never said nuclear. There are multiple code words for nukes used by political and military leaders, but the fact is, everyone recognizes the 500-pound gorilla in the room, but nobody wants to say it. The most powerful recorded nuclear detonation belongs to Soviet Russia's Tsar Bomba, a weapon 1,400 times more powerful than the nuclear bomb dropped in Hiroshima. That's enough to level the entire city of New York and destroy much of the surrounding area. The US, NATO, the West, however you want to see it, is now directly at odds with a nuclear superpower, and it's important to understand what all of that could mean. I turned to two experts on nuclear strategy to help me understand this topic.
So my name is Jeffrey Michaels. I'm a senior fellow at the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. My actual title is the IEN Senior Fellow for American Foreign Policy and International Security. And in terms of publications, I think the most relevant one for this discussion is that I'm co-author on the 4th edition of The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy with Sir Lawrence Friedman.
What does NATO have to do with nuclear weapons or war?
It's not an issue of NATO per se, or NATO versus Russia, or even the US versus Russia. This is a basic problem of the nuclear age. And it's interesting that you brought up the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon that was built and tested, because one of the interesting questions going back to the 1950s, and this is something that the very famous nuclear strategist Herman Kahn talked about in his book on thermonuclear war, was this question about, could you actually build a doomsday device to destroy all life on the planet? And would this be the ultimate deterrent or not? Or could it even be used to coerce other countries? So, like you said, why can't we just take over all of Europe or all of the entire world while we're at it, or something like that? And sort of for me, the question is, why was that never built? And it was also a question for him as well. Why didn't we actually continue building these enormous nuclear weapons that could destroy all life, and so forth? Now, the caveat to that, of course, is that we actually have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire world anyway. And we have sort of nuclear winter thesis and all the rest of it. But as it relates to sort of Russia and Ukraine and NATO and the US at the moment, and why haven't nuclear weapons been used, it's a fascinating question, which I don't have a good answer to, as much as I would like to say that I do have all the answers. But probably the long and the short of it is that there's no reason to use them at the moment. You gain nothing by using them, but you actually incur a lot of risks if you do use them, which is why I think from Putin's perspective, from Russia's perspective, they've been extremely reluctant to do it. So, there are different ways that you can use nuclear weapons. And sort of you have the question of sort of who's the audience, who's the target. I mean, in some senses, I think that if there was one country that would be very fearful of Russia using nuclear weapons, it would actually be China, because China would not want to risk a nuclear conflagration that they themselves didn't actually sort of start, for some purpose that they had in mind. And in that sense, you do have to go back to the 50s again, because it's sort of a reverse Khrushchev. Back in the 1950s, what you had was a situation where the Soviet Union was supplying a sort of nuclear kit to the Chinese. They didn't do it for very long, though, because the Russians were worried that the Chinese would start a war with the Americans, and then they get dragged into it. And from the Russian perspective, they did not want to get dragged into a war with the United States that they themselves didn't actually start. So you have this very complicated relationship of allies in relation to nuclear weapons. Likewise, for example, the Soviets were not willing to give nuclear weapons to their Warsaw Pact allies during the Cold War because they were afraid of what they might do with them. So you have this issue of control over nuclear weapons, which is quite important. What could Russia actually do with nuclear weapons if it wanted to? Now, there have been various theories that have been discussed. So probably the most common one is some sort of nuclear demonstration. So they would actually use a nuclear weapon. They would test a nuclear weapon, probably on their own territory or at sea, or perhaps even in an isolated area of Ukraine itself, basically to send a message. This is not a use of nuclear weapons that would actually kill anybody or kill very many people, but it would basically demonstrate that actually this is, you need to take us seriously. And if you don't start taking us seriously in terms of negotiations to end this war, we're going to escalate even further. And perhaps use it on sort of a proper military or civilian target. So it's basically used to coerce an adversary in that sense. Now, again, there are various aspects even to that theory. So there's we might call it the defensive aspect, which is if Ukraine was actually on the offense and driving the Russian forces back, that the Russians would actually use nuclear weapons to so-called escalate to de-escalate. So in other words, they would use nuclear weapons to say, okay, our forces have lost enough and you need to stop this right away. You need to order a ceasefire and you basically need to freeze the battle lines where they are right now. So that's one aspect to it. There's another aspect, which is the sort of the offensive this is the coercive aspect that you were talking about. Well, why not just use nuclear weapons to frighten the Ukrainians and say, we're taking all of your territory or we're taking all of the Donbass or something like this, and you just have to accept it. But there are problems with this, as there have been throughout the entire nuclear age, which is that it doesn't actually stop the conflict from occurring. Throughout history, throughout the Cold War, throughout the nuclear age, countries have not actually said, we're going to take territory, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to nuke you. They've never done that because it's been viewed as too absurd. You could not actually blackmail countries in that way. You could not blackmail the international community that way. It would be against international law, et cetera, et cetera. So the risks of going down that path are just enormous. And what you would actually get in return is just too inconsequential.
There are unwritten rules on how to handle issues concerning two nuclear powers. Putin laid one of them out directly by addressing the potential action by the US to directly intervene. This unwritten rule was verbalized by his clearly stating the conditions for support. Nothing direct and nothing over the top, which is why you don't see US planes, troops, or even some of our higher-end equipment going to Ukraine directly from the US, but support coming through our NATO partners, at least from what we can all see. But does NATO complicate the nuclear issue?
There's literally no other way to explain it unless you actually go back to the Cold War. Because at that point in time, essentially there's a continuity in the thinking, which is important here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Warsaw Pact fear was that NATO was going to attack them. Okay? From our perspective, this is totally nuts. It's crazy. The whole purpose of NATO was actually to prevent the Russians and the Soviets and their allies in the East from actually attacking West. The idea that somehow NATO would actually be attacking into Eastern Europe was just considered totally beyond the pale. It just could never happen for all sorts of political reasons. It just was never going to happen. Nevertheless, that was the whole basis for the Warsaw Pact, for the Soviet Union, for keeping such large forces in Eastern Europe, and so forth. This idea of a NATO attack onto their territory that they controlled of their communist allies in Eastern Europe. Now, sort of fast forward to the end of the Cold War, the fear is still there. Now, again, it's completely groundless in the sense that sort of why would anybody attack Russia? How would you attack Russia? When you talk about NATO, for example, we have problems with Afghanistan. Much smaller states. What on earth could we even be thinking about? Nevertheless, they have this mentality, which is, I think, rationally makes no sense. But if you repeat something often enough, you tend to believe it. And so I think they certainly have repeated it ad nauseum, so they probably do believe this. If there's some sort of NATO threat, they can't really define it per se. If you ask them to, is this going to be an invasion where they try to capture Moscow? Is this sort of like 1941 all over again with Hitler invading and Barbarossa, or 1812 with Napoleon, or Carl XII back in the 1708 or whatever it was. Something like that. But nevertheless, this is sort of a big fear, which I think in large part has been generated internally by what we might call the Russian military-industrial complex, just like the Soviets had their own military-industrial complex as well, which is basically building up this threat, which you need to justify having a certain military with certain capabilities and so on and so forth. So in practical terms, NATO does not present any sort of threat to Russia, and it never has. But at least that's from the perspective of inside NATO. From Russia's perspective, if they think it's true, then perhaps it is true and it is a threat, and so on. So it sort of complicates matters in that sense. On the nuclear side, I think it doesn't really complicate matters too much in the Ukraine case. It actually creates more problems actually in the NATO case, which is to say, if Russia invaded, say, Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, a NATO state, in sort of a major way, it would actually complicate matters, because the question then arises, where on earth do you use nuclear weapons? Do you actually use it in Estonia, or do you actually use it on Russian territory? Does the North Atlantic Council actually authorize this or not? Does the US do this on its own, on behalf of NATO? So you get those sorts of questions about how do you actually do this? Where do you do it? When do you do it? Does anybody give authority for this beyond the President of the United States? And so on. So that's a more complicated issue. And it was always, even during the course of the Cold War, when nobody really knew how this was going to work. We just sort of hoped that the other side wouldn't get us into that sort of situation where we'd have to make that kind of decision.
Who authorizes a nuclear response? NATO? The US? What type of response do we make? Nuclear or conventional? The world, it feels like, is drifting somewhat backwards. The fall of the Soviet Union was supposed to mean an end to this type of fear or even strategizing. But here we are, re-examining 1950s and 60s doctrine to understand what's happening in 2022 and 2023.
Well, honestly, it feels like we're going back to the future, meaning we are moving forward. Every day is a new day, but at the same time, we're experiencing political developments where we thought that was all long gone. Countries threatening each other with nuclear weapons, large-scale conventional war returning to Europe for the first time since the end of the Second World War, large Russian tank armies moving forward. All that has a feel of the Second World War in a way, but then there is this nuclear component, which was clearly not part of the Second World War. So it feels like we have thrown all the big crises of the last 70 to 80 years into a mix, and here we are today. And for me as a German, I'm only like 1.5, 2 hours flight away from Ukraine. This feels very close. And honestly, even as a peace and conflict researcher, I knew that the security situation with Russia and in Eastern Europe was not good during the last couple of years, perhaps for the last 10 years. But I did not expect it to go down south that fast and that significant like we experienced since February 24, when the Russians attacked Ukraine.
That's Dr. Ulrich Kuhn.
My name is Ulrich Kuhn. I'm a German citizen. I'm based in Hamburg at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, where I lead a research program on arms control and emerging technologies. And that means that basically I deal a lot with nuclear weapons policies, arms control of nuclear weapons, as well as conventional weapons, conventional deterrence and conflict in Europe, NATO-Russia relations, US-Russia relations, all the stuff that we currently read a lot and hear a lot about.
The US has been actively supporting Ukraine's fight against the Russians. I wanted to know if just our support alone, which has angered the Russians, is enough to escalate the situation in Russia.
First of all, let me mention that Russia is not just upset because the US has kind of like indirectly entered that conflict and therewith the war in Ukraine, but they're also upset that the US and all its allies, not just in Europe, have managed to forge a united front against Russia. And that, as I just said, does not only include countries that are directly affected, like Poland or Slovakia or Hungary that are bordering Ukraine. It even applies to countries like Japan or South Korea, and even non-aligned countries that are not part of NATO alliance or other alliances with the United States. So that's important that Russia has really, and Putin himself has maneuvered himself quite into a corner. And then there's the question about the nuclear dimension of the entire conflict. I mean, let's face it, the war started with a nuclear threat. On February 24, Putin made it explicitly clear that whoever tries to interfere in that, as he calls it, special military operation, might face devastating consequences. So he did not use the word nuclear or nuclear weapons, but I mean, everyone understands what he's talking about. Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads. It's the world's largest nuclear arsenal that the Russians are commanding. So clearly this has a nuclear component. And to be honest, during the first, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks of the war, I was really concerned. And it felt like we are approaching a crisis of the magnitude of the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 1960s. I'm a bit less worried since a couple of weeks now, but still, I mean, this is involving a nuclear armed state, Russia, that has used its nuclear arms to shield a conventional aggression. And it also involves the United States, another nuclear power. It involves 2 other nuclear powers in NATO, the UK and France. So this has a clear nuclear component. And I would say this is a much more dangerous conflict than most of the proxy wars that we have seen throughout the Cold War.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has pretty much validated everyone's fears about Russia. There was a time after the collapse of the Soviet Union that there were talks about dissolving NATO, that Russia was different, new flag, new me kind of thinking. The problem is that the government was taken over by former Soviet Union officials who had been running it in the past. So despite a new flag and quote-unquote open and free elections, today's Russia very much has the spirit of old Russia. It's even arguable that Russia has done more to solidify NATO in Europe than any other nation-state actor.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that makes me really concerned is that I don't see any strategy on the Russian side how to get out of that conflict if the Russians are not achieving their overarching goal. And by the way, we only know about the overarching goal from Mr. Putin himself, and he is known to be, well, at least to have a difficult relationship to the truth, to put it mildly. So he basically talked about denazifying Ukraine, which we all know is just propaganda bullshit, but basically it means taking over the entire Ukraine. But the big question for European security writ large, and therewith for NATO and the European Union, is would he stop with that? And what if he does not achieve that goal? What if Russia is losing more and more and more soldiers? So I just read today in the New York Times that the US intelligence community estimates 70 to 80,000 dead Russians already in that war. That does not mean 70 to 80,000 official military dead, but still, that's a huge number. This is more than the Russians lost in Afghanistan. This is more than the US lost in Vietnam. So this is a huge number. What if this number is growing? What if the Ukrainian military is faring better, also due to the weapons deliveries from the West and the United States? Where is the exit strategy for Russia? If Russia has no exit strategy, then we do get a problem, because it means at some point Putin will feel that he's being pushed into a corner, and I don't want to see that man commanding some 6,000 nuclear warheads being pushed into a corner where he does not know what he should do next. That is a scenario where I'm still deeply concerned about.
When we talk about nuclear issues, it's really easy to get hung up on nuclear weapons. After all, Russia and the US could destroy the world several times over with the number of nuclear weapons each country possesses. But there's another nuclear issue we need to address. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, quote, Ukraine has 15 Russian-designed nuclear power reactors at 4 locations, generating half of Ukraine's electricity. 7 units are currently in operation, unquote.
I just this morning, I wrote on Twitter that perhaps we're entering a nuclear crisis, but not the kind of crisis that we expected. So not involving like all the stuff we just talked about, nuclear warheads and submarines and strategy and all that stuff. But maybe it's just a horrible accident. So we're talking about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the south of Ukraine, which is, by the way, the largest nuclear power plant in the entire of Europe. And Europe has many nuclear power plants. If we would see a chain reaction with a core meltdown at that power plant, it would cause an environmental catastrophe probably bigger than what we've seen in 1986 with a Chernobyl incident. So what does that tell us? It basically tells us something that a former colleague of mine, James Acton, wrote about brilliantly a couple of weeks ago, where he wrote, a war zone and a nuclear power plant, that does not go well together. You don't want to have a nuclear power plant in a war zone with open shooting and fighting going on, and one side capturing that side and using it as a kind of sanctuary to shoot at the enemy because they know the enemy can't shoot back and all that stuff. It's just horrible. So we have to differentiate a little bit here between what are like near-term risks and what are perceived risks. So a near-term risk is clearly that this power plant has to run 24/7, and it's run by Ukrainian technicians, engineers, and so on. And those ones are now under Russian control. And as far as we know, They're being harassed by the Russians. They're being forced to work. So they're under enormous psychological stress. But these people, they need to function 24/7 without being threatened. So that, for me, is perhaps one of the severest risks that we're facing, that because due to psychological stress, these people might make a mistake, and that would cause a larger accident at the power plant. And then there are long-term risks involved, which concern the actual fighting and shelling, like we have seen or like we heard about last weekend. Because let's face it, normally a nuclear power plant is a rather secure building. You will often hear and read in the media that it should sustain an impact up to a crash from a civil airliner. Imagine a civil airliner with all the kinetic power hitting a nuclear power plant. That's quite something. At the same time, we don't know how these reactors might fare against shelling with sophisticated and modern missiles that might deeply penetrate that reactor. We simply don't know. But there, I would say, hopefully, this is not an immediate risk. But let's face it, if we come to the point where the worst happens, where there's going to be like a big incident, that would immediately elevate the war to a larger crisis affecting all the surrounding countries. And remember Chernobyl. It was infecting the entire of Northern as well as Western Europe, depending on the wind and the weather conditions. I hope we're not getting there, but the situation looks really, really dangerous down there.
It's pretty clear, I think, that in response to a nuclear incident, that if it's a nuclear response, then it's all over. You can't just fire two, one at each other. It just escalates from there to an extinction level event. I asked Dr. Kuhn if he thought it was possible for a nation to engage in a non-nuclear response to a nuclear incident.
The honest answer is we don't know, because these deliberations take place in the US and they take place in all the nuclear armed countries, within the military and also in political circles, small circles, where people are talking about actual strategy and employment strategies in case of nuclear use. And yes, particularly during the last couple of years, there have been lively debates, and not just in the expert community, some have transpired into the media, and the media has reported about it. What if Russia would use just one or two or three so-called smaller nuclear weapons for what purposes? To intimidate NATO, to demonstrate that it has crossed the nuclear threshold. And let's not forget, that's a taboo that we have since now 70 years. That was the last time that these kind of weapons were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was in 1945. So this taboo still holds until today, but some people are concerned that Moscow could break the taboo. And yes, there have even been high-ranking war game simulations in the US throughout the last couple of years about how the United States would react and how that would play out. And the bad news is that in many of those war games, tabletop exercises, we ended up in nuclear holocaust, meaning that one nuclear weapon used by Russia led the US to reciprocate, led the Russians to up the ante, and then the Americans. So what you just said about tit for tat. And then tat means in the end, not tat, but dead. So, but the good news is that there have also been tabletop exercises where it was possible to de-escalate the situation. And I personally think that the US would be wise in such an extreme scenario, depending on what the Russians are doing with nuclear weapons and on what scale, not to reciprocate using nuclear weapons for two reasons. First, Russia using a nuclear weapon in that war, for whatever purpose, would cause such a massive international stir and backlash against Russia, a backlash that so far has not happened against Russia. Because let's face it, beyond NATO and the other US allies, there are still many people and countries out there that have not spoken out against Russia. India, not. China, not. Many countries not. In Africa or in South America. Those countries would speak out if Russia were to break the nuclear taboo. And the other reason is, I do believe that the US and NATO has at its availability many weapons to intimidate Russia that are conventional, meaning non-nuclear, and they should use it before they get into the game of reciprocating with nuclear weapons.
So it would seem that a nuclear country can essentially bully their way around the globe. As I said before, with their finger hovering over the nuclear button, looking at other countries like, don't make me press it, there's nothing to stop a country like Russia from continuing on in their conquest, because they're going to establish the limitations on who can enter the fight and how they enter the fight, or they'll use nuclear weapons, which kills everyone.
Well, the Russians just made the point. Yes, they do. If you want to, yes. You can use nuclear weapons for several purposes. I would say all those purposes are purely political. And you can then, depending on your political choices, make military choices. But in terms of real military fighting power, they have almost no use, except for you use them and then there's a high chance that everyone dies, including yourself. So the Russians have shown one thing that is horrible, and that is you can use nuclear weapons against other nuclear countries to stop those countries from coming to the rescue for other non-nuclear countries. It was a bit complicated the way I say it, but basically it means push the others back and hit the weak one that has no nukes. And let's not forget, the Ukrainians gave up Soviet-era nuclear weapons that they possessed, even though they were not in possession of the launching codes and everything, so they couldn't basically use these weapons. But nevertheless, they gave them up in exchange for so-called security guarantees. Guess from whom? From Russia, to, respect their sovereignty, respect their borders, respect their territorial integrity, and so on and so on. And that's just horrible. Russia is setting a horrible example on the international scene. And other countries do see that. The Iranians see that. They see how much it is worth to get a promise. Will they get a promise from the US? Will they believe that it's true? Will they keep the Americans their promise? What about the North Koreans? We want Kim Jong-un to give up his nukes, right? So at some point, we need to offer him something. What do we give him? A promise again? Will he believe that promise? They're setting a terrible example on the international stage. And I personally fear, because of the war, nuclear weapons have gained so much in importance that for the next years and decades to come, there will not be any talk of seriously downsizing the number of nuclear weapons and of nuclear disarmament. And personally, I think that's a really sad outcome because, let's face it, humanity needs a couple of positive goals in the future to which to work upon. And nuclear disarmament is one of those goals. And I think that because of Russia's behavior, it's being pushed so much into the future that I'm not going to see nuclear disarmament before I die. Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic in that regard. And by the way, a new Cold War, a serious conflict between the US and Russia, and perhaps another conflict between the United States and China. Don't we all have something to tackle here? I'm sitting in Hamburg. We have the hottest summer ever in that city. And I think it's not the only city around the world where we're experiencing that at the moment. Climate change and the effects of climate change is the big threat to humankind, and we should tackle it together. But instead, we spend all our energy on stupid wars and new conflicts and probably new arms races. And that's just a terrible outcome.
Dr. Michaels.
I think one thing that I'm a bit intrigued by at the moment is because you're hearing more and more discussion on the Russian side about annexation of that bit of territory that they've actually conquered, which effectively means, making it part of Russia, and whether that actually changes the nuclear dynamics in any way. Frankly, I don't really think it does, not in any meaningful way. But from their perspective, would they consider, say, Ukrainian, if Ukraine tried to reconquer this territory, would they consider that potentially worthy of nuclear escalation? I think that's one thing. Frankly, I don't see Ukraine launching any large-scale offensives that would drive the Russians back in any massive way, at least not anytime soon. So I think, thankfully, this question is probably not going to arise, but it's something to consider over the longer run. Likewise, whether the Russians would use nuclear weapons to try to take out one of the HIMARS systems or something like this because they can't locate it in any other way. So basically use this as an area weapon, an area denial weapon, or something like that. Again, I don't think it's very likely, but it's something potentially to look out for. But I think more generally, however, it's sort of the question of under what circumstances would they be incentivized to even use nuclear weapons or to think really seriously about using them. Frankly, I don't think that they've reached that point because in their minds, they're still on the strategic offense. They've not even transitioned to defense, although they'll probably need to do so very quickly, probably by the end of this month, if not earlier. But I think more importantly than that is that at home, Russia is still claiming that this is a victory. And as long as they can get away with that, as long as nothing fundamental is being affected inside Russia itself, there's really no incentive at all to use nuclear weapons. So that'll be the sort of my last contribution on that.
Recently, a public service announcement was played in New York City about how to survive a nuclear attack. The ad drew critics claiming it was alarming and disturbing, while others say it was necessary to prepare the public for a real nuclear emergency. There are fewer Americans alive today that remember hiding under desks or practicing going to a fallout shelter when they were children in school. But today, we're having those discussions once again. Peace is a fragile state, easily disrupted for a number of reasons. Those reasons, noble or evil, depend on which side of a conflict you stand in. But the result is the same for everyone in a nuclear engagement. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Timothy Sayles, Dr. Jeffrey Michaels, and Dr. Ulrich Kuhn for their invaluable insight into understanding NATO and nukes. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at StripesMMPod, and you can follow me at RodPodRod and Jack Murphy at JackMurphyRGR. Go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast to save 50% off your digital subscription. That's 50% off your digital subscription by going to stripes.com and using promo code podcast. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode. This episode is brought to you by TektoGear, TekTogear.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The TektoGear knives won't cost you half a month's rent either. Today, TektoGear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TekTogear.com. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to TekTogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.